Since My Hero Academia is over and with the release of the new Ultra Age Databook, we've gotten more information on the history of quirks in the series, so it's time to spill all of the details. You see, officially, the first quirk user was the glowing baby who was born in China. Immediately following this, paranormal abilities started to be discovered all over the world, and not only because they just began appearing, but with our knowledge that All For One was likely the true first quirk user, it paints the picture that once the glowing baby got so much attention, it forced governments all over the world to actually look into these claims where they would go on to find other quirk users slowly appearing. Now, the databook reiterates what we know, that quirks usually manifest before the age of 4, and that usually a child will inherit at least an attribute from one of their parents. Regardless, when a quirk manifests, it must be reported to the government so that the quirk can be registered, which is a good way for officials to keep track of who has what and where. So we know that eventually roughly 80% of the world is filled with quirk users. However, in the early days of quirk-based society, a strange dynamic began to arise, the dynamic of vigilantes and villains. These groups formed as, of course, there were people who chose to abuse the power of their quirks, and other groups that went against the law and saw the good that they can do with their quirks, forming groups of vigilantes who would eventually be given nicknames by their enemies. These nicknames will go on to become the origin of hero names, since of course these vigilantes would try as hard as possible to not reveal their identities during this warring period, since it would put their families in danger. Likewise, the term villain arose in kind roughly at the same time as a catch-all phrase for the enemies of the heroes and vigilantes that kept cropping up. Now, going back to that glowing baby, we know that when interviewed, the mother of the glowing baby complained that everyone was treating her baby like it was something special, but in her opinion, glowing was just her child's quirk, literally meaning just something small about him that makes him different. But that was enough for the term to spread like wildfire, as news stations title her the mother of quirks. Eventually, as society stabilized, more science was done on what we know to be quirks today, and they discovered 3 distinct types of abilities. Activation types, which are the most standard, where someone has to willingly activate their ability for it to be used, and there are subtypes within this group like augmentation or restraint types, but most of the quirks we see in the series fall within this group, like Bakugo's explosion or even One For All, whose power has to be activated by the user. Beyond that, we have transformation type quirks, which involve a sort of physical change in the user, like how Mount Lady can become a giant, or Gigantomachia can turn his hands into claws. Even Kirishima's hardening is considered a transformation quirk. Lastly, we have the most undesirable archetype, the mutant quirks, later changed to be called the heteromorphic class. These quirks are constantly manifested from birth, and this class is the reason why some people are born as bird people like Tokoyami, or with a strange appearance like Shoji. These quirks have physical changes that are also accompanied by a separate power, like how Tokoyami's quirk isn't just being a bird man, but also includes his usage of dark shadow. This change in society led to the creation of quirk marriages, where people would specifically be chosen for marriage based on the compatibility of their quirks, or the likelihood that their next generation would be even more powerful than their parents because of their quirks being mixed together. This actually became a problem across the globe, leading to human rights violations and destroyed families like we saw with Endeavor and Ray, but it also led to research on quirk factors, the specific gene within a human body that's responsible for the appearance of quirks at all. This gene is passed from parent to child and influences a lot about what their quirk will be and how powerful it can get, but one day a lone scientist realized that if things continue as they are with quirks getting more powerful and more complex, that one day they'll get too powerful and complex for newborns to be able to contain, leading society towards the path of extinction by way of evolution, something that funny enough we never actually saw handled in the series, as by the end of it, there's still nothing to stop this day from coming, meaning everyone in MHA is living on borrowed time until they evolve to the point where they can't exist anymore. Scary. But now, thanks to the final databook for the series, we've gotten a lot of information on the One For All users, so much so that it's going to take a few days to get through all of it. However, one thing that I know a lot of people would just like to have is the full names of each user. So starting with the first, we have Yoichi Shigaraki, and of course this is All For One's younger brother, but we also learned that these two are twins, with Yoichi being born only shortly after. And you know the story about him, right? All For One stole all the nutrients while in the womb, so his brother grew up frail, and that would lead to All For One giving him the quirk that would eventually mix of Yoichi's to become One For All. Now, eventually Yoichi would be freed and pass on the quirk, even though we never learned exactly how him and Kudo figured out that trading DNA was the way to pass the quirk on. Sus. But that leads us to the second user, Kudo Toshisugu, the user of Gear Shift and the man that half the fandom swore was Bakugo from the future, but thankfully he ended up being a character who stands on his own as being the leader of the original anti-All For One alliance, and the one who really started this story by reaching his hand out to Yoichi in that dark room room where he wasn't even sure if the man was a friend or foe. Alongside him at that time, he already had the man who would become the third user as his right-hand man, and the third user's name is Bruce Lee. I kid you not, that's actually his name. Now, Bruce Lee, the Fajin quirk user, is actually the person who not only discovered the one-for-all quirk within Yoichi, but he actually named the quirk as well before beginning his search for the elusive fourth user. As the years went by, Bruce heard rumors about a man named Shinomori Hikage who was extremely hard to find. Upon learning about Shinomori's Danger Sense quirk, this gave him faith that Shinomori would be able to elude All for One and stockpile One for All for a long time, passing the quirk on to him after he found him. But we know that the fourth user, Shinomori, actually tried to do just this, but was unable to because the level of power within One for All had already reached a point where it was dangerous for a quirk user to hold, as after having it for 18 years of solitary training, cracks appeared in his body that forced him to pass the quirk on to someone else. That someone, who by the way happily took on the quirk even knowing the drawbacks, was Daigoro Banjo, the user of Black Whip and the fifth holder of One for All. This guy was the opposite of Shinomori. He actually hunted All for One down relentlessly, facing him head on multiple times, and I'm sure at this time this was All for One's original All Might, since it was at this point that All for One realized that the quirk was still out there being cultivated, as Banjo would continue on to form a new anti-All for One coalition. Through that process, he ended up recruiting a man who said that Banjo and the fight against All for One became his entire reason for living, and that would be Tatsuyai N. At first, Banjo actually tried to avoid giving the quirk to N, but once the sixth holder and user of Smoke actually got his hands on it, he wasted no time in properly organizing the alliance within the shadows, leading to the recruitment of several key heroes like Gran Torino and Nana Shimura's husband, who we already made a short on. Now from here, when All for One finds the group and takes out Nana's husband as well as N, she is left to pick up the pieces and takes on the quirk as the seventh user to continue their fight with her float quirk, but eventually she would meet a young man who had a will that burned like fire and the perfect constitution, so she passed the quirk on to Toshinori Yagi, and he would go on to become All Might, the symbol of peace. We know that eventually he gives it over to Izuku Midoriya, otherwise known as Deku the New Symbol, who gives it to Tenko Shimura, otherwise known as Tomura Shigaraki, the hero of the villains, where the quirk is finally destroyed, along with All for One and Shigaraki himself. And that's basically the entire history of One for All, but now let's dig deeper into the actual bits and pieces of what happened over the course of the users' lives.